everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Final Focus, a debate podcast that dives deeper into the real context of the arguments you'll likely be debating. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Tejas. And today we're going to be talking about the January 2026 public forum topic, which is resolved the People's Republic of China should substantially reduce its international extraction of natural resources.
We wanted to note that this is a pretty quick topic. This is only the topic for January. We'll get a new topic for February very soon if it's not already out. So that means you really have to think about how you're going to allocate time to this topic. If you're only going to a single tournament, keep that in mind when you're thinking about your prep.
Yeah, and even if you aren't debating this topic, it's still definitely worth learning about because it's super relevant to our lives every single day, and it's definitely going to be relevant to future debate topics as well. And as a quick note, this is a podcast that's going to appeal to people who want to learn more about geopolitics, about the world, not just debaters. But with that being said, today we're joined by our guest, Jonathan Allen, who graduated from the University of Chicago with a bachelor's in public policy and a master's in international relations. His work has centered around international norms building and securitization of critical minerals, with a regional focus on China. Most recently, he completed a program with Securing America's Future Energy in DC, where he worked as a critical minerals policy intern and really got to understand this field, right there directly. So I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan. Can we just start off by talking about what exactly these natural resources are and how they're extracted?
Yeah, so thank you, Tejas. Thank you, Kirsten. Really honored to be here. I absolutely love talking about critical minerals. I'm really happy to share what I've learned. And I think, me saying critical minerals kind of gets at the sort of thrust of what these natural resources are. So what is a critical mineral? A critical mineral is really any sort of resource that kind of meets a checklist of certain attributes to that relate to America's economy. Practically anything could be a critical mineral. It does not depend on its rareness that it is like the rate or rareness at which it is found within the Earth's bedrock or anything like that. What it has to do is with a given material's importance to the American economy. One other factor is, kind of how rare it might be, but typically when we talk about rarity, more so has to do with the difficulty of extraction more than anything. And a third factor being a risk of supply chain disruption. Something you might have already heard about in news headlines and such is China's tariffs, or sorry, China's like export restrictions on rare earth technologies. And this going tit for tat between the US and China. I think rare earths is actually a pretty great illustrative point of, kind of like what goes into the considerations of a critical mineral. We don't call them rare earths because they are necessarily, again, rare within the Earth's bedrock. Rather, that the technology that is needed to refine them from the rocks we pull out of the ground is quite specialized, intensive, and also, again, concentrated within China. And a reason why many of the minerals you kind of consider to be critical have much of their extraction and refinement capacity linked to China or other foreign entities of concern. Another critical mineral would be copper or cobalt. These are critical minerals that, again, are very large, right? You find copper everywhere in your life. Your phone's appliances, cobalt, in your iPhone, rare is obviously in your iPhone as well, along with, other sorts of elements you might think as typically being rare, such as germanium or other kind of, elements that are a bit hard to pronounce. Yttrium, YTTRIUM, hard to, I forget the pronunciation. It's that, kind of small. So again, to kind of recap, critical minerals can have very large markets of very large volumes like copper or cobalt, but are still considered critical because of their importance to our national economy and the possibility of supply chain disruption,
Mm.
again, primarily coming from China. or it could be much smaller mineral markets. Again, these sorts of fringe elements like germanium and stuff, but still very critical for certain technologies. Those being phones or especially defense technologies. You need pounds upon pounds of critical minerals to create fighter jets, to create tanks. And the fact that China has about 90% of a corner on all of the refinement capacities, or, from 60 to 90% of extraction capacities for many of these critical minerals, it poses a very kind of acute sort of threat to America's defense industrial base, to our consumer supply chains with things like iPhones. And what we've seen in recent years, or really only in the past year or two, is a big shift in America's kind of priorities in being able to create their own supply chains. If you haven't heard, the Department of War recently signed a joint venture with Apple to invest in a rare earths mine in Mountain Pass, California. That is the only rare earth mine that exists in the US. There's plans for, more mines to be opened within the US. There's also plans for the US to be engaged in mines abroad. But as I think we'll kind of come to learn on this podcast, the fruits of all these efforts will take some time to
Yeah.
really realize themselves. And something I would hope to illustrate to all of you is that mining is hard. It is super difficult. And I'll leave it to you guys to kind of, pick apart, some of what I just said.
Yeah, yeah. So you're already kind of answering this question, but I'd love to drill into this a little bit deeper. So when we're thinking about international extraction, you've mentioned China, you've mentioned the United States. Are there other big players in this space? What else is kind of happening in the status quo related to critical mineral competition?
So you'll hear China be thrown out a lot. China has aggressively pursued a policy of, engaging in international extraction, whereas America hasn't. And there's many kind of reasons to sort of explain why that is. But I would say a big one is sort of a lot of actual policy making within the US. So if you think about Africa, for example, diamond mines, though diamonds are not critical minerals, I think this is kind of an example many people might know and is very easily transferable to critical minerals. So we've all heard of conflict or blood diamonds before, and those are diamonds that are extracted in areas of conflict where, their extraction and, their purchasing might fuel terrorist organizations or other things that might destabilize a region. And following that, many countries have kind of pushed to, move away, push for conflict-free diamonds, other things like that. And we can kind of get into how, there's ways that, these bad actors are able to sort of circumvent this. But that kind of gives us a bit of insight into why the US doesn't have engagement in mines in Africa, or at least historically hasn't until now. There's been legislation that's passed that essentially prevents US investment into countries where there is reasonable concern for, like conflict being surrounded by these extractions. And it's not just simply that, the US wants to shy away from, like, oh, we don't want to invest in something that could potentially be funding a military organization or et cetera. There's very real logistical concerns that come with this instability as well. If US investors invest into a mine and then at some point the mine is taken over by rebels, other bad actors, that is an extremely acute risk to mining. And that gets piled on top of plenty of other risks. There's risks with permitting. These mines must meet certain standards, and it takes years upon years for them to be able to kind of overcome these hurdles to get
Yeah.
permitted. They must meet their investments, like quotas, right? Mines cost a lot of money, and they cost a lot of money throughout very distinct parts of a mine's development. Before you even can have a limited production run of, minerals being taken out of the ground, you have to secure so many kinds of types of investments that we'll talk about. Moving on to the second part of your question, other big players. Um, I would say that there's a lot of very interesting outside of China. Other countries that have very varied strengths. China, for all intents and purposes, has all those strengths covered, right? They have connections to from the most upstream parts, which is what we consider extraction in a supply chain. Upstream being, physically taking raw material out of the ground. And they also have control over the downstream components of supply chains. And that would be everything from refining, just like further enhancing these raw materials and then actually turning them into products, iPhones, defense technologies, commercial technologies, you name it. Other countries have really strong abilities in some parts of these
Mm.
areas of the supply chain and might lack some in others. A really great example is countries like Japan and Korea. So Japan is a really great example to start off with because, as you know, Japan is an extremely export-oriented economy, meaning that most of their GDP growth, most of their income comes from the export of electronics and other sorts of items that require large inputs of critical minerals. And this has been true for them for decades. So they have been much more attuned to being able to finance critical mineral projects abroad, especially because Japan really does not have any sort of critical minerals that they already sit upon. They're quite poor in the sense that they can't do much mining within their own borders. And because of that, they've adapted to take on very, I guess, like a greater risk appetite for critical minerals projects. And that means that Japan has many sorts of financial and kind of government policy arms to be able to finance critical mineral projects, and they have been for a while. Korea is very much the same. Korea doesn't have too much mining going on within it, sands but they do have some like refinement capabilities. Zinc is a big export that Korea creates. Korea Zinc is like one of the largest providers of zinc worldwide. And they too are an export-oriented economy that relies on critical mineral inputs. These countries have sort of a playbook that the US is hoping to adopt in the sense that they have more aggressively pursued engagement in international mining projects, particularly in South America. Whereas Australia sort of stands at a bit of an opposite of that. Australia lies upon vast critical mineral
Mm.
deposits. Copper, cobalt, I believe some rare earths. Um, you name it. Australia probably has, oh, lithium is another big one that they have, pretty large swaths of access to. And as a result, Australia has historically had a strong extraction industry, within its own borders. It obviously has, its own interests engaged in critical mineral projects in Southeast Asia, given the proximity, and whatnot. But I would say that Australia is much more extraction focused, though obviously they have refining capabilities, certainly a powerhouse in terms of being able to, again, pull raw materials out of the ground and then turn them into very viable products, be it within Australia or within other countries. And again, many mining companies, powerhouses are based in Australia or have, branches in Australia. Some big mining companies would be Anglo American, which, recently merged with Teck, Newmont, others, but again, that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. And I'd say like another interesting partner would be Canada. Canada also has similarly very strong extraction capabilities. They are sort of on the same page as us, and they want to really move down the supply chain in the sense that they want to support projects that, can turn raw materials into actual, like high value exports. Other countries are that are very strong players in this market are developing countries that have vast swaths of raw materials. So that would include Chile, Peru, DRC, Rwanda. Um, and they have had interesting ways of kind of making themselves even bigger players. And moving away from like a status quo that essentially has kind of, I wouldn't say robbed, but deprived them of a lot of the money that gets made in these markets. So for the longest time, the model is that, foreign companies would set up mines, and we'll use the DRC for an example. DRC has vast cobalt and lithium reserves. These are the things you need for iPhones. These are also, again, things you need for like jets. You need them for everything. What would happen is, a company that maybe wants to turn this cobalt and lithium into EV batteries would just simply buy out the raw lithium and cobalt from DRC, import it back into their home country, refine it, sell it at a much greater cost. A battery is obviously going to be worth way more than just, the hunk of cobalt you get out of the ground. And what the DRC and other countries have done to sort of, I guess, kind of have a bit more of a fair deal on this is they've placed export restrictions, meaning that
Mm,
they will not allow for the exports of raw materials. This forces foreign companies to invest within the DRC, to invest in refinement capabilities. And that in turn gives the DRC the ability to kind of sell refined cobalt, refined lithium at a higher price, and that can then be reinvested into their economies.
okay.
So, to recap, we have developed nations that have critical minerals underneath their ground, like Canada, Australia, developed nations that don't have critical minerals underneath their grounds and have kind of become really, risk like have strong risk appetites for a broad, sorts of projects. And then we have developing countries that are seeking, like to kind of level the playing field a bit. And they have been successful in doing so. Again, another sort of way of approaching that would be Chile, Peru, and their mandates of state involvement or state participation in critical mineral projects. They have state agencies that often own about 25% of stake in critical mineral projects. And we can talk more about stake later on.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like China pretty dominant, but the status quo shifting a little bit. Countries are getting a little bit more thoughtful about what resources they have and also intentional about how they kind of protect those resources long term. Is that fair?
Certainly.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
So I want to kind of shift the conversation back to China here. So one thing Jonathan, I heard you talk about a lot is how, unlike other countries where they might have a lot of expertise in one part of the supply chain, be that, upstream on the extraction level, or downstream, or other countries that specialize in a certain type of critical mineral. China stands apart from all of them because they've managed to dominate all sorts of critical minerals across the board, as well as dominating the entire supply chain. And earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that their international extraction capabilities are around 60 to 90% of all extraction and around 90% of all refinement. I want to get a better understanding of how exactly did China develop this expertise in critical mineral extraction and generally the critical mineral supply chain as a whole? How have they become so dominant in this industry? And when and why did they move away from their own borders? Because, as I understand it, China itself is very wealthy in natural resources.
Yeah, it's a really great question. much of this has to do with the way their banks operated. It's kind of gone under some changes recently, but for example, again, I can't, the names of the specific banks aren't really kind of coming to mind, but there were these policy banks that the state had obviously a lot of control over and being able to kind of execute China's policies for them. Um, China, and I guess another factor is, like I kind of implied before, we very much let China dominate this. There's a really great quote from a Canadian Prime Minister that says, "We are so thankful for China for," and I'm paraphrasing this a bit, but taking on the dirtiness of extraction. And also the sorts of negative kind of like all the harms that come with, these large industrial projects. And the West was very content with, in a very much a NIMBY attitude, as in not in my backyard, that, they didn't want what many Western countries didn't want to have mining operations within their own borders or refinement operations within their own borders because, that drives down property values on homes, that releases kind of fumes and all of these other horrible things into the air. It causes, acids and things to like leach into the water. But China was more than willing to be able to kind of take on this burden for most of the world. Um, and at the same time, I think China also realized that, we can kind of make ourselves a keystone in this entire market if we also kind of not only take on the extraction component, but also the refinement component. And I think that China's development into, like going from a developing economy to a developed economy, has also kind of necessitated that push outwards, right? Like most of the mining and extraction that happens in China is within the Bayanobo region. And that exists within Inner Mongolia. It's these large kind of flats. And there's a lot of rare earths. There's a lot of, I believe, cobalt there as well. I could be wrong on that. But China, in pursuit of obviously kind of raising its standard of life, has implemented a lot of measures to kind of mitigate the environmental damage that is created by its, extraction operations within its own borders. And in sort of the same vein, but again, as more of a secondary reason, it obviously has kind of created, I think, a policy of like since the 90s of engaging in international mining projects. So China has had a head start, and to put a number on it, a $57 billion head start. That's their total investment into critical mineral supply chains.
That's
And
great.
this is sort of like how the US and its allies, this is the level of investment that, they need to be able to sort of match to be able to compete with China. And again, China had these policy banks right behind that would kind of essentially take on a lot of the risk that Chinese mining companies would normally shoulder on their own. Again, to enumerate these risks, there's geopolitical risks, there's technical risks. The mine has to be feasibly sound, in terms of like its actual technologies. The mine also must be big enough to be able to make money with these markets. Again, critical mineral markets are extremely volatile. Prices go up, prices go down. And if it goes down for like a long enough time, that could shut a mine down. But these policy banks were willing to, again, back financially many of these mines and sort of get them through rough periods. So big, obviously, kind of very obvious financial instrument is direct equity investment, meaning that these banks, take on stake, take on ownership in these mines in exchange for, providing much needed resources to get them off the ground.
Yeah.
They also provide loans, as in, a typical loan that you might like consider. They also provide loan guarantees, which essentially means that, the mine will secure a loan from one bank, and then a third bank will be like, okay, if this loan defaults, we'll pay you and you'll be good, right? Like we'll make it safe. So through loans, equity investments, and loan guarantees, China has been able to significantly shoulder much of the risk that is associated with mining and allow Chinese companies to flourish abroad. The US and many of its allies, on the other hand, sans, you know, Korea, Japan, which are much more, have a greater risk appetite, they have had historically a very, they have been very risk averse. And there's some ways in which this is changing now.
I
So
don't know if this is a question or a comment, and I'm curious for both of your opinions on this, but I think one of the things that I struggle with on this topic is I think in a debate space, we often approach topics from a US centric lens. This resolution is a question of should China do this? And from my reading, I think my takeaway is China is pretty smart, right? This was a long play that they executed really strategically and thoughtfully over decades. And I think it's also kind of naive to say that we didn't need these resources, right? We did need these resources. Everyone needed these resources, and no one else wanted to do the job. And I think one of the things that I keep coming back to is, like sure, like you said, it's dirty, right? Mining is dirty work. But dirty work is often also required to get to a greener alternative, right? You see that, with copper. So I'm curious kind of like, like when you guys think about that tension, where do you kind of fall? Like I'm kind of on team like, like just because America's jealous we didn't do it doesn't mean that we can really fault China for what they did because we kind of needed them to do it. And I'm kind of like, man, what a play. Like what a plan they had when it came to this work. So I don't know, spicy take, but what do you guys think?
Tejas, I want to hear your opinion too.
yeah, I mean, I think like one definitely they had this kind of very impressive like grand strategic foresight to dominate this industry. And I think what I think of is the quote from Deng Xiaoping, who was a leader in China after Mao Zedong. I think from the late 1970s. He said, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." And I think that kind of sums it up. Like they were able to recognize the value proposition that these critical minerals brought to the table. So when I think about the wording of the resolution here, I almost think, is it even possible to compete against China at this point with the huge, kind of financial, but also just, in terms of international relationships they've cultivated and just time and energy spent on critical minerals, the head start that they have. Is it possible to compete with China and for the West to actually, feasibly challenge them? Or is a real challenge to China's dominance only possible through cooperation with China?
Yeah,
And that's what I think of because in any universe where China substantially reduces its mining, it would be because it came to an agreement with Western countries. It would never do it, for no reason on its own because why would they give up that dominance?
right.
You
And I think the other thing I come back to is like when it comes to the levers that a country has to influence other countries, this is one of China's best ones, right?
Yeah.
To be able to say to the US, we don't care about your tariffs. We're going to withhold the things that you need to build in your country. Negotiate with us is powerful. And I keep coming back to, from that perspective, why? Like why would China do this? And I think you're right, Tejas. Like they independently on their own accord don't really have an incentive here.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe this is getting, and Jonathan, I want to hear your opinion on this too. This is kind of getting into debater territory of really thinking about, what could China gain from reducing their extraction? What I think about is their soft power, and I think this is something Jonathan can really touch on here because China's been trying, a lot to cultivate their soft power and their diplomatic power and really establish themselves as a legitimate leader in the world stage. And one of the main complaints that countries have had against China is that they use their economy and specifically their domination over critical minerals as a tool of coercion. We saw it happen with the tariffs. We also saw it happen with Japan a few years ago over a dispute in the East China Sea. So, I'm wondering if some sort of reduction in extraction, or at least over their stranglehold in this industry, would be a gesture of good faith and send a costly signal that would boost or bolster China's diplomatic power, especially with Western audiences.
Yeah, so I think you guys really hit on the head. Kirsten, you're totally right in believing that, yeah, China very much executed on a very well thought out plan, and we let them. I think we knew that we let them, and it's only really now that we're waking up to the fact that China is eating our lunch. In terms of what Tejas said, like, is there even a path to competing with China on this? Is the only path cooperation with them? I certainly believe that some element of cooperation with China will be necessary for the West to build up its own critical mineral supply chain. But the biggest strength that the US has is that every other country in the world is really waking up to this too.
Mm.
It's not just the US, it's Canada, it's Australia, it's the EU, it is countries in, South America. And also, these developing countries where extraction takes place, they just want to have the best deal that is given to them. China is the one that has provided that best deal to them. There's no doubt about that. But they will, they're willing to negotiate. They're willing to come to the table. There have been plenty of mining projects that have been kind of mired in sorts of disputes, not disputes, but rather, you know, there's obviously government participation in the stakes of these, mining operations. And in the DRC, I can't remember exactly the mining operation, but there have been maneuvers to sort of kind of move away from China's stake in this project and kind of give it to like a Western company and things like that.
Interesting.
So there's ways that this can like work out. And if they're like, if the US is willing to give the right incentives, but we haven't given those incentives. We haven't, not neither to private industry in the US nor for these foreign companies. This is looking to change a little bit. Again, in the future, I think that, the Development Finance Corporation and the Export Import Bank of the US are almost certain to have their authorizations, meaning, the budget essentially that they're given for investments, loans, loan guarantees, expanded as they're due for reauthorization if they haven't already been, given these reauthorizations. But yeah, and on the topic of, like, is this even a good thing for China to stop their extraction? Is it a good thing for soft power? I would actually argue that it's in China's soft power interest not to reduce it. I think that wouldn't be the right costly signal. I think the right costly signal would be like, okay, we're fine with American participation in our mining projects, or we're okay with giving up our participation in mining projects. But you have to remember that mining is such a risky industry, right? These mines, they need to compete with, especially in large critical mineral markets where, price fluctuations can again, like really do in a mine or not operating at even at like even if China is like, okay, unilaterally, or even just for a specific critical mineral, they say even just a 25% reduction in the extraction, mines will close.
Mm.
And that like will harm China's reputation with these developing countries. Maybe it will like, like appease, maybe it will brighten China's image for Western nations, but I don't think they really, that's not what they're going for. I think what they're going for is they want to get soft power with these developing nations. I think a way for them to do that is be like, hey, we're okay with maybe kind of stepping back and, these sorts of critical mineral things. We will give you the option of, having American participation, or in a very idealistic view, US or like Western and Chinese participation with participation from a developing state participation in a mining thing. But you know,
Yeah.
reducing extraction unilaterally will not only hurt the mines in developing countries where this is happening and threaten them with closure, it will hurt the bottom line of American businesses too. So again, if you are like um, General Motors, right, and you are, you want to make more EVs and things like that, almost all of your materials on some way are going to be coming from China. As GM, you are definitely investing in projects in the US, projects in allied countries and things like that. But you are doing this, GM has already been doing this because they know that in the future, this will pay off. It will shield them from supply chain disruptions, such as China unilaterally reducing, their critical mineral extraction, right? And they're okay paying a higher price on these sort of friend-shored materials, as in, just extract or buying materials from where extraction happens in allied countries and such. They're okay with knowing that because they believe in the long term things will equal out. But the truth of the matter is that companies will do what's best for them. China provides the most competitive prices on these critical minerals. And if the China reduces their, extraction of critical minerals across the board, then that means that whatever's left after China's consumption of these critical minerals, they're going to have to go for a higher price. And you could maybe argue that, oh, well, maybe we can have the price of China, maybe that, maybe reducing extraction would have the price of China's critical minerals go above US ones. But I think that, for the US, for like French or allied US ones to be able to kind of, again, now compete with Chinese minerals, they'll raise the price too. It's
Yeah.
not gonna, like I would say a much better, like it will only really help the US and its allies if China again unilaterally kind of like lowers its critical mineral like extraction only in the event that we have a very robust supply chain created.
Yeah.
Even then, that would create such a shock to the price of critical minerals that I don't think it would be beneficial. It would just kind of be a bit more mitigated kind of effect. Like
Yeah.
again, I'm of the opinion that if China did this, it would really rock a bunch of critical mineral markets, and US companies would kind of be in, like they would be scrambling to figure out like what to do next. I think a better question is more so like should America import less Chinese sourced critical minerals? And that's a bit more debatable. But even then, again, it's the onus is on America
Yeah.
to give them the incentives to have private companies, invest in refinement operations, to have mining companies invest in more extraction operations. China will do China. China does what China does, and it will keep doing what China does. Really, the task set forth for America is to provide the right incentives in the same way that China has for the development of this supply chain. Until that happens, countries should just do what's best for them. Or sorry, companies should do what's best for them.
All right, that makes sense. And I guess based on everything we've talked about, it really feels like if we want to, develop our critical mineral industry as a country, it has to be a team effort. It can't be something that the US does on its own, especially since, as you mentioned, different allies bring different strengths to the table in this game. So my first question, part of this question, I guess, to you would be, what is the ideal strategy that the US and its allies can develop, and what cooperative framework should they develop to make up for this $57 billion deficit that you mentioned earlier? And the second question is, given the importance of critical minerals to all countries, especially in tackling global challenges like climate change, is there a way to establish a global cooperative framework that works for everyone and unites countries like China and the US rather than dividing them based on competitive lines?
Yeah. So, to kind of like give a stab at that first, sort of stem of that question, how can the US really, successfully tackle the $57 billion deficit? The first thing is to kind of make a big tent, You need to work with so many different countries, and the more countries you have engaged on cooperation, with, like on critical mineral issues, um, the better off things will be. There is a coalition of states. The name is really escaping me right now, but it's currently being led by South Korea, um, that the US created initially for to just kind of have countries be aligned on this, like these sorts of policies. Um, and that's like a start, right? I believe it's South Korea, Japan, the US, Australia, a few countries in Europe. And the name, again, its name is like really like, flying over my head right now. But I'll come back to you with the name of the organization in just a moment. Um, that is like one part of it, like to create a big top, and to have countries work together. And the biggest benefit you get from this is the risk sharing that happens. If the US did this alone, it would have to shoulder all the risks that go with creating mines. A really great statistic to kind of illustrate this point is that 1 in 10,000 identified, like kind of potential mineral, like, extraction sites, um, only 1 in 10,000 makes it like becomes a viable mine. So, and again, for a variety of reasons, from permitting to technical things
Wait,
to
can you say that again? 1 in 10,000?
1 in 10,000.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so the need for risk sharing is it's an absolutely vital component. Not only should the US not do this alone, it simply can't. It really can't. So it will need to create, I think, like joint ventures with a lot of countries. And the US has kind of been taking steps to do this. President Trump recently met with Australia, Japan, and Korea and announced several projects. Both like projects that would be built in the US, projects that would be built in, Japan, Korea, Australia, and also projects that would be built as a joint venture in a third country. And this is very much a very correct approach. The second thing that the US needs to do is it needs to pony up a lot of money for these projects. Again, it's not just risky, they're also expensive. They're going to need to have, very like strong access to capital to make these things work. Um, and the US also has been taking a lot of like very strong steps in this direction too. So I mentioned DFC, the US Development Finance Corporation, and EXIM, or the Export-Import Bank of America. DFC is essentially a state-backed agency slash corporation for private investment into projects. So a recent, very notable example is that DFC provided a lot of funding and capital for the Lobito corridor, in the DRC. And that's like kind of a bit of an economic corridor through which a lot of trade will be happening, like railroads, like moving actual critical minerals like through, and that has been proven to be, very helpful for their economy. Um, and the US will probably continue along this and, use DFC to be able to fund, these critical mineral projects. And they've been giving DFC about a $250 billion reauthorization, within a congressional bill. Again, I forget if it's passed already or not, but it's very likely that it will be passed. And DFC specializes in providing equity investment into projects, as well as providing loans, loan guarantees. The Export-Import Bank, on the other hand, is also can operate both in domestic and international contexts and has a lot of capabilities for lending. It doesn't provide equity investment, but it has a whole swath of other sorts of specialized, you know, levers for, making policy things happen. So they've recently announced something called single point entry, and that would allow and it's in collaboration with Australia and Australia's export bank, the Export Finance Australia. And essentially, what that would do is any either US or Australian company can go to either EFA or EXIM. And when they receive support from them, they'll have access to both the full swath of capabilities from both banks. And that's a way to kind of have a very much built-in joint venture for these mining operations. There are also you know, uh, programs that Exim has announced for that would essentially provide project funding equal to the percent of offtake of critical minerals given to specific companies. Offtake essentially means that when a company invests in a critical mineral project, they will ask for a certain percentage of the output from that project for however many periods, and they lock in a price at which they buy that. So what this enables is companies will be able to gain XM support, and if a mine promises, say, 50% of, their critical mineral output, then XM will provide 50% of project funding for it, which is like, a very, like strong, bold move. Obviously, these projects need to be a little bit later on in their development. But again, this is a very strong financing tool. There's also like other sorts of financing mechanisms that Exim has that allows for much more flexible sorts of financing terms, specifically for critical mineral projects. So there's a supply chain resiliency initiative is another one, and essentially any sort of industry that is kind of threatened by China's dominance can seek much more flexible loan tenors, meaning the time in which they need to pay back a loan and much better interest rates on loans, and all these other sorts of incentives for critical mineral projects. So the US has been really kind of stacking up the offerings that they're willing to give these, mining operations. But again, we haven't really seen too many deals under these programs, mainly because mining projects like take a
Yeah.
while to
Yeah.
become viable, to even be qualified for all this funding and all these things in the first place, right? You need to prove to Axim, to prove to DFC that this is going to be a solid investment,
Yeah.
And many other countries, again, like Australia, like Canada, like the EU, have all introduced their own sorts of funds to be able to provide really flexible financing. Italy has created a sovereign wealth fund, and basically that what it will do with a sovereign wealth fund is it will provide financing for a critical mineral project, and for new projects, it will kind of take a sort of like percent of the revenue created from these mines, and then that will go back into the sovereign wealth fund for reinvestment. The EU has announced I think a few billion, it might be like around $1 billion critical mineral fund for, critical mineral projects across the whole supply chain for projects both within the EU and outside the EU. The Canada has similarly announced, a large investment fund for critical mineral projects, and Australia already has a fund that is managed by Expert Finance Australia specifically for critical minerals.
Yeah.
So there's so many tools out there, but the only way they're going to be able to really kind of compete with China is if the money is efficiently used.
Yeah.
With all these sorts of, big pots of like, like money that are being announced and hoping to be mobilized, it's very important that these countries don't accidentally compete with one another and that they kind of get the most, they can really stretch their dollar by working together and engaging in like heavy risk sharing. And I think that's why Trump has kind of gone to Australia, Japan, and Korea first, because they have some of the most robust financing mechanisms with some of the most, like with some of the best risk appetites, and some of the best expertise in mining. So, Japan obviously is able to finance projects across the whole gamut of a project's life cycle. US Exim and DFC, not as much. I think they'll get to that point. But they really need, like partners in Japan. Japan has JOGMEC, which is their natural gas and like other like natural resources, like state-backed, like kind of quasi corporation to invest in these things. They also have JBIC, which is their, sort of international bank for financing these things. Korea similarly has Komir K-Share. K-Share specifically provides loan guarantees, and they provide very large loan guarantees. And the beauty of that is that if so long as K-Share provides loan guarantees to like loans that they know will work out, they don't need to spend any money, right? They're just there as insurance in the event that it does fail. And they're very good about, again, picking the right things and providing this extra assurance, right? That's the beauty of the loan guarantee is that it gives both the bank and the critical mineral project much more confidence in their ability to kind of pursue this knowing that if there's a default, things are going to be okay. I think that cooperation with China is like a very great ideal. I want cooperation with China on critical minerals. But just for the sake of, like the US and all of its allies, they really just need to kind of rely on each other right now. And I think if they can kind of make a very formidable answer to China's supply chain, then the cooperation can come into play. But this is all very forward thinking. Much of what
Yeah.
I've just kind of discussed is a bit early in its infancy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We only have a couple more questions for you. And I'd love to kind of recap and see if there are any other big insights you'd like to leave our audience with. I think there are three really big things that have stood out for me from this conversation. I think the first is we need critical minerals. We need them for lots of things. We need them for technology. We need them for green technology. We need them to build at large, right? These are economically very important. The
Hmm.
second one, China is dominant. That was intentional, it was planned, and it was something that the US historically was really on board with, and so was most of the world. And I think the last one that I've really been thinking about is, but the status quo is changing. Countries like you've mentioned, the US, Europe, Australia, see this China dominance as kind of a risk. And I think it's interesting that you're highlighting, there is a path forward when it comes to diversifying who's doing this work, but it's messy, it's complicated, and a sudden decrease in mining from China would likely create real harm, even if we're doing it thoughtfully and intentionally. So I'd
Hmm.
love to know from your personal experience, if you had to pick one other thing that you're like, don't let this other thing get lost in this conversation to leave our audience with, what would it be?
Yeah. So I think that I'll leave you with like two things, and they're pretty interlinked. One is the importance of substitute technologies and
Hmm.
also recycling. Um, this is a perfect way to kind of get around the nastiness of mining.
Wait, wait. What is a substitute technology?
All right, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So Essentially, just any way to kind of substitute what would be a critical mineral with something that's not a critical mineral, if you can help to do it. So, good example is rare earths are used for very strong magnets. But if you can make magnets without rare earths, as in a non-ferrous magnet, then you can kind of axe out the sort of supply chain risk that comes with that.
Hmm.
These are technologies are very, kind of nascent, but they deserve the investment,
Okay.
especially for the payoff that they present. Recycling is another path to this, another way of relying not only on China, but just not relying on mining in general. If you can, and the biggest way this kind of comes in is with EV battery recycling. The EV batteries, once they're spent, they can kind of be taken apart into their like cathode components, and then I believe that there's like technologies that kind of can reach like 90 plus percent recovery rates and like these materials to then be repurposed into new batteries. That totally eschews the whole extraction supply chain completely, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that can like reduce the amount of critical minerals you need. And I think that that is something that no matter how you cut it, even if you're affirmative or negative on this argument, both these technologies, both substitution and recycling, will play huge components in, the US's approach to competing with China. And that is it's a very self-sustaining way of ensuring that the US has access to critical minerals and technologies that it needs. And the kind of interrelated component with this has to do with developing nations and ensuring that, you know, while the US and, China are kind of competing over these supply chains, that they ensure that, the global South isn't, you know, really like horribly negative affected by all of this, right? Like mining, again, is dirty work, but it's also often unregulated in these countries. And where mining happens, is higher cancer rates. There are all these other horrible negative externalities that sort of come with it. And I think that one strong path for the US in creating its own supply chain and using its big tent of allies is kind of enforcing stringent regulations on, extraction, enforcing things such as traceability, meaning that you have a strong understanding that this is where this, like this cobalt came from, and this is where it got processed, and now it's here. Because there's ways to kind of already fudge certifications, and bad actors can obviously, manipulate that. If you have strong traceability, you can really reduce the political or, geopolitical risks that kind of come
Yeah.
with, the horrible parts of it, extraction.
Yeah.
And I think that these sorts of components fit into both sorts of, sides of the argument,
Yeah.
right? Like you can you can maybe support China's continued extraction, but you could say, well, we need them to have like better sorts of, like standards on traceability, and we can use our big tent to sort of get them on board or force them on board. And also, if are like, no, China needs to reduce their extraction, that way we can kind of, again, propagate, these sorts of like strong standards. That's another way of thinking about that as well. And also recycling and substitution, I think, again, will be a vital component for both of these. And for those that are supporting China's continued extraction of these products, that is kind of a way you can say, like, this can kind of be a sort of like stopgap. The substitution recycling can be a
Yeah.
stopgap as we figure out our own supply chain.
Yeah.
And can also kind of reduce the need for a very, very strong supply chain. Whereas, somebody arguing that China should reduce their extraction, you could say, well, if, they reduce their extraction, that gives us much more incentive to invest in recycling and in substitution, et cetera.
Yeah. I really like the recycling substitution point. I hadn't thought about that. And I think, Jonathan, I don't know if you debated or not, but my mind went, oh, these are really interesting internal links to a lot of arguments on both sides of the topic. I don't feel like we have time to dig into them now, so I'm just going to like say them in hopes that students like cling on to this. But I think recycling, substitution, interesting space for the affirmative.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And
And
just one, I want to leave with a very, I think, very like something that kind of like blew my mind a little bit about the sort of, I guess, recycling component. Not necessarily, it's not necessarily the recycling of the actual minerals, but there's this company in South Africa that takes agricultural waste and is able to extract rare earths from it, which is
Oh,
just
that's
kind of
cool.
like, and the US has plenty of agricultural waste, right? Like there are plenty of waste sites that have loads of critical minerals in them that we just aren't looking at, you know?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
again, affirmative can think about that.
yeah.
Cool.
And another thing I'll quickly mention is Jonathan talked about this a little bit in his last answer. The idea of transparency, right? So one of the main issues with extraction is that it's so noxious to the environment and to native populations living near a mining area. And one of the main concerns that the affirmative is going to bring to the table is the, mass harm that's kind of happening because of mining operations, especially in conflict areas like Myanmar or the DRC, where there's just less regulations and it's more opaque. And thinking about how transparency can increase in this space is important. And there's already, mechanisms that facilitate this. For example, there are these efforts called transnational extraction governance initiatives, or TGIs, that
Mhm.
countries and companies can participate in to make sure that their investments are transparent. I mean, these initiatives have issues and aren't always effective, but it's important to remember that transparency is important. And a lot of investments end up not being successful because a lot of countries don't want to buy minerals from conflict areas, especially if the transparency isn't there.
Yeah, 100%. That is a big, the transparency question is a big roadblock or has been a big roadblock for the US to kind of import and support investments into critical mineral extraction in many developing countries. A big example being, Rwanda, DRC, the kind of the signing of like the peace agreement between the two has given cautious optimism as to the future of, US companies' ability to invest in these countries and invest in critical mineral projects in these countries. So supporting transparency and supporting like peacekeeping is a very strong component that will like lead to the success of diversifying supply chains. And also another thing to kind of, one last thing I really want to kind of leave with, and this might kind of support the negative a bit, is that oftentimes when you want to create a mining project, there's so much secondary, like dual use infrastructure that goes with it, right? Really great example. There's a mine called Reko Diq in Pakistan, and it's out in the middle of nowhere. So to make this mine viable and to have people, be able to work here, they need to build roads, they need to build generators, they need to build schools, they need to build all these other things. And mining companies will do that. If it means that, they will like be able to secure the project and countries can demand that, foreign companies, provide these sorts of, like add on, tack on, positive benefits. And I think really in any sort of case of extraction, you have to really weigh, not only just, the profits against, the negative externalities, but also these sorts of social and social benefits that kind of come with it too. These infrastructure benefits that come with these as well. These are also things you can kind of add to like weigh up for the positive, and it's a way to kind of offset, the negative ecological harms that kind of come with mining. Obviously, there's technologies and ways you can offset the ecological things, but you can do that all day, but again, it's a sort of if you build it, they will come type of
Hmm.
deal.
Yeah.
Right.
It needs a mine needs to have the lots of infrastructure to support not only its operation, but the livelihoods of everybody that's surrounding, everybody that's working there.
Right.
So there's a lot of good that can kind of come with mine development if done correctly, if done with traceability, etc.
Yeah. Okay, to kind of finally circle back here, back to the topic, and I'll remind the viewers the topic is resolved. The PRC should reduce its international extraction of natural resources. I think maybe our viewers can probably already guess, but Jonathan, where do you end up falling here? Do you believe more so in the affirmative side of this or the negative side of this? And kind of to end off the discussion, what strategy would you recommend for young debaters who don't know much about this topic to learn more? What resources can they leverage, and what sources should they look to first to make sure that they get a really strong understanding and start for the topic?
Yeah, I'm pretty strongly in the negative, mainly because, just a unilateral reduction in China's extraction not only hurts China, hurts the mines, also hurts US companies, right? They'll be forced to pay more for minerals, and that leaves them with less money to invest in parts of the supply chain. What I think should be done is that companies should just do what makes the most sense for them right now, and the US must kind of set the stage, create the incentives for them to invest in allied supply chains.
Yeah.
And only then should, the US think about reducing imports from China. Um, as I say, China will do what China does, and nothing's really going to stop that. And that's sort of what the US should operate on. And also, again, any sort of unilateral decrease in extraction, this will cause some crazy shocks to the price of like certain critical minerals. The mining industry is super cyclical. If if a large mine in China announces that they're ceasing or they're pausing, extraction or production for a while, that will cause fluctuation in, that price of the mineral up until they go back online, and then the price will like adjust again, and then this, and that affects projects all over the world. That affects the price at which they can sell these minerals and affects their long-term viability. Um, these projects need stability in the pricing. They need stability in the risk that can be kind of burdened. I think that reducing this extraction across the board introduces a lot of volatility that actually will kind of backfire and hurt the ability for the US to build out its own supply chain, as kind of paradoxical as that sounds. But truly, I think that this will be a gradual process, right? Like it won't be that like China stops overnight, we figure it out, and we're on our way. If there was a way that we like didn't need to rely on China for these minerals, we would have done it, right? Like it would have already been done. We wouldn't have this debate topic, right? So it's okay if we rely on China. We just need to be proactive in creating a diversified supply chain. And that's the biggest thing.
Perfect. All right, great. Kristen, do you have any other final thoughts before we end
No,
off
I
this
just
discussion?
appreciated that it's a hard egg ballot from Jonathan.
Yeah,
And it's always good when there's transparency.
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Again, you know, I think there's ways you can definitely approach the positive, but, from my own experience, I think that, the negative makes so much sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
And to get even more like debater mode here, like one thing Jonathan said that I think affirmative teams should definitely use as a really smart weighing strategy is if you can prove that companies are going to make less money in an affirmative world, then that basically means that, it's impossible to increase the Western, supply chain and critical mineral dominance to begin with, since that's essentially the goal of the affirmative, right, is to wean the world off of Chinese dependence. Well, the negative team can come back and argue that no, well, now things are just going to be more expensive and you're not going to be able to invest in those supply chains to begin with. So dependence doesn't change. You're just dependent and now you're paying more at the same time.
Exactly. You summed it up best.
Okay,
Tough.
perfect.
Well,
And
thank you.
yeah,
Thank
I
you,
was,
Jonathan. Were you going to,
yeah.
sorry, Tejas.
No, I was just gonna say for all the debaters that at least I've talked to that are really worried about debating the neg side of the ballot, hopefully this should be encouraging for you.
Yeah.
But yeah. But Kirsten, go ahead.
Thanks, Jonathan. This was really great, and we appreciate your time today. Tejas, you want to say anything else?
Yeah, thanks again for the conversation. And if anyone has any questions at all, you can drop it in the comment section below or wherever this is uploaded, and we'll be sure to get back to you. And we hope everyone enjoyed this conversation. And please keep reading and learning more.
Yeah, I'm really honored to be here in the first place. I love talking about this stuff. I'll talk about it to anybody who listens. And if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to kind of help these two, answer them in the comments, provide my own insights. But yeah, no, I hope this was very helpful and productive.
Great.
All
All
right.
right. Thank you. Bye.